Hey there, and welcome back to Temporary Locals.
I am Jared.
And I'm Megan, and this week our guest is taking us to Turkey, and specifically we're going to talk about a lot of sites, but Göbekli Tepe. Tepe?
Tepe. Very exciting. We've technically done an episode on Turkey. It was actually our very first guest episode way back when.
Yep.
Less than a year ago, but way back in our early days.
Yep, it was Turkey and Greece in one.
And it was a double destination episode, Turkey and Greece, but that was more general travel. I think this episode is going to be a lot different in that it's going to focus a lot on ancient history, ancient sites, and the kind of stuff that I'm really into personally. So, yeah, I'm really excited for this one.
Yeah, me too. But before we get into that, if you are new here, Jared and I are an adventure-loving couple sharing stories and real experiences from the places that we've actually been. And sometimes we have guest episodes where we host fellow travelers who've been to places that are still on our bucket list. So whether you're planning your next adventure or you're just here for the storytelling, you're in the right place. And we are so happy to have you here. We hope you stick around, subscribe, join us. We put out new episodes every week. A little bit about our guest. He is a return guest. Vincent Kane is an England-based explorer, adventurer, and researcher of esoteric mysteries. He speaks and presents slideshows to small groups, hosts some temple and pyramid tours in Egypt, which we'll touch on today, and he is also currently writing his first book. You can find Vincent on Instagram at Facebook at Mysteries Cool, and that's MYSTERYS Cool. Like COO. Like Jared mentioned, we previously spoke to him on episode 43 to discuss his time in Egypt. You should go check that out if you haven't. We are really excited to chat with him again. He's always a good conversation. And without further ado, let's get into the episode. Meow.
All right, everybody. So on this week's episode of Temporary Locals, we have Vincent Kane coming back on the podcast. He came on a couple months ago and talked about his trip to Egypt, and it was really interesting talking with him. He's a big fan of ancient history and ancient civilizations, like we are here at Temporary Locals. So we wanted to have him on to talk about his trip to Turkey and some of the ancient sites that he visited in Turkey. So we hope you guys enjoy it, and thanks for coming back on, Vincent.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Megan. I really enjoyed the last show we done on Egypt a couple of months back, and so I'm really thrilled to be on here again. I really appreciate the invite. And so, as you mentioned, I'm very deeply interested in travel and adventure, but also ancient history and prehistory. Like ancient megalithic sites, ancient ruins, and so on from around the world. So that tends to be what kind of guides my compass when I choose to travel somewhere. I go somewhere with some kind of relevant or important facet or part of history that I'm wanting to explore. And so over the winter here in England, while the weather was cold, I had a really hectic, busy work season. And by the end of January, I was like kind of tired and exhausted, but I had some free time and I'd like gone and earned my money, so I could just sort of sit back and relax. And I thought, it's still cold and it's still grey. So I decided I wanted to start planning some travels. And so right at the beginning of February, I was sat up late one night, a few days into February, and I was just browsing some flights just out of curiosity, thinking about where I might go over the coming months. And now I'd never been to Turkey before, but I had keen interest for many reasons. But in terms of ancient history, there's obviously some very well-known sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and many others that are quite popular in the media at the moment. So I knew that I wanted to get there eventually, but I'd never been there before. I've got no contacts there, no sort of knowledge of the modern day Turkey, apart from a few friends that have been on like just general holidays and said they liked it. That's about as much as I know about getting around there. Not a lot. And so, I was up late one night just browsing, and I looked at some flights and some hotels, and I thought, I really want to get out of England. It's cold and it's wet, and I've been really busy, and I've finally got a break. And so late at night, I booked a return flight to Turkey just for a very short break for a few days there. I booked the flight and the hotel, and I was on the aeroplane less than 48 hours later, because what I found over my many years of traveling is that every once in a while I like to do something very spontaneous and just like out of the bag, I decided to go, and I was there 2 days later. And as I say, I had no prior experience of Turkey and no contacts to meet the other end. So I just went on a whim, really, knowing that what I wanted to achieve there was to see a couple of ancient sites, including Göbekli Tepe, which is very well known, and a few others, which I'll get to shortly. And so I went with no prior knowledge, and I sort of intentionally didn't look too much into planning anything. I thought, like, as long as I've got a hotel and I've got the flight, well, like, what can go wrong? Uh, so I jumped on the plane and off I went. It didn't occur to me because when I've had friends visiting Turkey, relatives visiting Turkey that have gone there just for like a beach or poolside holiday, they come back a bit tanned and they say, it was nice and it was hot and it was sunny. And so I didn't really think in less than 2 days before my travel to consider what the weather might be like in February. And so I packed light and I arrived there and it was far more wintry than I anticipated. So I didn't have any warm clothes. I didn't have a proper jacket, just a thin kind of shower jacket. And it actually turned out to be quite cold. So, so that caught me off guard. That meant I was somewhat physically on edge for the whole time of the visit because it was like rather chilly. But that kind of, I don't mind things like that. It sort of adds to the experience to have something unpredictable going on. I had to stop off in Istanbul on the way with rather a long stop off because that was the flight that was available. But it wasn't long enough really for me to leave the hotel in Istanbul and go and check out the place because that would have been great. I'd love to go there too. But so off I went and I flew out to Sanliurfa. I think that's how you pronounce it, which is southeastern Turkey. What once upon a time, before Turkey was called Turkey, before we had that particular border, it was the region of Anatolia, ancient Anatolia. And so, I flew into Sanliurfa and I came out of the airport and I jumped in the first taxi that showed up. And the guy that took me to my hotel turned out to be a really nice, very friendly, helpful guy named Ali. And although it didn't work out very financially viable to use a regular cab on a meter, since I was only there for a short time and I had no connections there and no knowledge of the place, I decided for practicality and simplicity to just hire that guy for the entire time I was there. So I travelled around many hundreds of miles in a regular cab on the meter and it cost me a small fortune, more than the flight. But it was my own kind of, it was my own doing for turning up with no contacts and no research. I've researched the ancient sites, but not the modern world, But I kind of like doing stuff like that because I just like hurl myself in at the deep end and see what happens. Because like I'm grown up, I know I'll get through and figure stuff out. And as it turned out, between it being out of season and a bit wintry, and aside from the ancient sites, some of the ancient sites I visited, aside from that, most of the places that I spent my time weren't particularly touristy places. The part of town that I stayed in wasn't a touristy area. And some of the other sites I went to weren't touristy either. And so I'm regrettably a lazy Englishman who doesn't speak foreign languages very well. Like I have every intention of gradually developing my multilingual skills. But as yet, I didn't have anything much to say when I got there. So I was using the Google Translate, which is a great tool in the modern world. And so just myself and my driver, Ali, communicating mostly through the Google Translate, we got around and I found that everywhere I went in all of these untouristy places, people looked kind of surprised to see me there, especially in the winter, I stood out because I was the only white guy there and it was out of season and out of tourist places. But I was really struck by just how warm and friendly and welcoming everyone was. And even without using the translate, like eye contact and gestures, and just sort of demeanor, you can communicate a great deal without words, and I really enjoy that. And I felt so welcome there. It really took me by surprise. I didn't expect to feel unwelcome, but it was unusually warm, like the people were warmer than the weather when I was there. So that was a real beautiful surprise, And so the hotel that I stayed in was, it was quite a cheap place, just for a short stay. Didn't have much in the way of heating, but it was quite a pretty little place. And so I spent quite a lot of time just walking around the local streets just to get my bearings in Sanliurfa. And Sanliurfa itself as a city, it reminded me in many ways of many Egyptian cities in terms of architecture and infrastructure. the way the roads are laid out and less hectic and maybe a bit cleaner than, say, Cairo, a bit more like Hurghada,
Mhm.
perhaps. But yeah, I felt kind of semi at home because I've spent so much time in Egyptian cities. So I liked Shanafra just as a place to hang out in. Like I enjoyed walking around and checking out some of the restaurants and like I couldn't really find a bar because they don't tend to drink much in the way of alcohol there. And I'm not really a drinker myself, but occasionally on a holiday, I like to have a beer in a local bar or on a beach or something. Like a beer will do me, one's more than enough sometimes. But yeah, I was hoping to go out more for social reasons, to go and meet people, to go and sit in a bar or something, but I couldn't find one. But that was cool. So I ended up in coffee shops quite a lot, which is kind of more favourable, really. I drink a lot of coffee, and I found some really beautiful traditional food in a very close by restaurant that came out in very, like, the place looked beautiful, very decorative, and the food was all served by people in very, like, traditional outfits, all silver platters and stuff. Not, it wasn't posh, but it was just very traditional, like grilled meat and skewers and various vegetables and rice and stuff. So I really enjoyed that side of it. But then with my driver, Ali, I'd kind of conveyed to him that I wanted to hire him for the few days that I was there. And I just gave him a little bit of a rundown of some of the key places I'd like to see, which on my list of important places primarily were Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Haran, Soğmatar, and they were the key places. There are a few other places I had in mind. I weren't sure about the distances and the practicalities of it. But the driver was so helpful, and he really got what I was into and really understood why I was choosing the places I was choosing. And so he looked at the places on the list and he planned out a good route so we could make the travel as efficient as possible, because it was all on the meter. So he was like being helpful to sort of like minimize doubling back and forth too much. But he also introduced me to a load of other places, many of which I hadn't even heard of, other cities and
Mhm.
rivers where you could go on boat rides and stuff like that we could stop off at on the way to, say, Göbekli Tepe or such other places. So he really embellished my travel with additional stop points, which were great. It was so nice to have someone who seemed to very quickly grasp what I was all about and what I was looking for, and really helped me to elaborate on that, so that I had the highlights of Göbekli Tepe and Soğmatar Haram, but they were kind of interjected with other beautiful little stop-offs. So yeah, I felt very, very fortunate in how it unfolded. The region of Turkey in the modern day, as I said before, it was ancient Anatolia, and it sits just
Mhm.
south of the Black Sea, and just round, kind of a little further north around the other side of the Black Sea, you have the Caucasus mountain range. And so that part of the world, through like history and mythology and religion and so on, it's synonymous with kind of Noah's flood and where the ark is said to have landed, and the dispersion of like survivors from a prior civilization, if we were to entertain such an idea. It's one of the possible locations where people, if you sort of follow the Noah's flood or the Epic of Gilgamesh, stuff like that, they talk about survivors of an ancient civilization surviving in ships with lots of people and animals and so on. There's variations of the story, but there's a general theme that runs through things. And that part of the world in particular, because we have the Caucasus mountain range, that's where we get the term Caucasian. And so
Mhm.
I'll preempt this before I speak any more on this, because we see people like Graham Hancock getting slammed by people that imply that he has some kind of ideological agendas because he mentions like racial types and skin colors and stuff, and like he gets unfairly slammed for that. And so I'll say right here and now that I don't believe in hierarchy. I think we're all equal valuable beings in this world, and we live in a shared environment. We're all in it together. So if I mention kind of like lineages and skin tone or eye color, it's not in a one-upmanship kind of way. It's just for like in the same way as I like to know where my great-grandfather came from, or a few more generations back, and a few more generations back, there's some part of me that relates to the Caucasus mountain ranges because I'm Caucasian. I don't think that makes me better than anyone. I think that's a load of rubbish, better or worse. We're all in it together. But yeah, I found it fascinating to go to that part of the world because I know there's some part of my ancient lineage that does relate to that. And as I say, just in the same kind of context of going to see where my great grandfather once lived, it's just more generations back. So I look at it through that lens.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
that whole region
Mhm.
around there, if we consider notions like survivors of Noah's flood, for example, even though the story's probably retold and distorted many times, just as a theme, it's kind of interesting that if there were survivors of a prior civilization that were somewhat developed and advanced, it's kind of interesting when we get to sites like Göbekli Tepe, where it appears, even in the mainstream narrative, to be one of the earliest, if not the earliest, places for the dispersion of agriculture and the sudden emergence of stonemasonry and perhaps stellar cults and stuff like that. You know, it seems to be like a hotspot around that part of the world for really interesting stuff happening really early on in the human timeline. So I think that somewhat reinforces the idea that there perhaps were survivors of a catastrophe, that some portion of them ended up in that part of the world.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the ark and the flood myth and all that. That kind of ties into this, especially this area of the world. I know you talked about Haran, the city. You mentioned that you had gone there, and I know that it's kind of famous because it actually is talked about in the Bible. It's talked about in Genesis. I believe that's where Abraham actually lived for a short time. Do you
yeah,
get the sense
yeah,
from
right.
being in some of these areas that like there is like a kind of a Christian or Judeo-Christian history there as well?
I mean, I didn't really kind of feel it in that context of the Judeo-Christian thing, but if you look at the history of some of the biblical characters, or from either like Judeo-Christian or Islamic, they sort of revere or honor or recognize some of the same characters or prophets and so on. And so, yeah, like the prophet Abraham was thought to have been born in a cave in what's now modern day Sanlerfa, where I flew to, maybe 4,000 years ago or so. And yeah, and so Haran's just a little bit south of there. It's like a short drive, maybe 30 or 40 miles south or something. And Haran itself has a history dating back maybe 4,000 or so years plus, you know, like at least that.
Hmm.
And so I feel like it was a significant place for some of the kind of characters that crop up in the Bible and the Quran and perhaps in the Torah. I've not explored the sort of Jewish mysticism or history so extensively as I have maybe esoteric Christianity or Islam. I'm not like a member of any particular group, but I respect and honor all expressions that people kind of find important and valuable to them. And I find it really interesting to read into kind of the origins and roots and myths and legends that crop up in, say, the Bible or the Old Testament or the Quran and stuff like that, because, you know, I think all of them have some essence of truth, even if they've been retold and distorted or sort of become under the kind of misdirection of agendas and so on through the ages. You know, like I think there's a lot of value in ancient stories and legends and beliefs and myths, and sort of a no
Hmm.
smoke without fire kind of thing. So with stuff like the Noah's flood, you know, I don't believe that the version in the Bible is the sort of matter of fact version, but I think it tells us something about the past, you know.
Right.
And also in reference to the prophet Abraham coming from that region, say 4,000 years ago, and yeah, possibly living in Haran as well. Abraham and his consorts Sarah or Sarah, and some of the kind of stories and attributes and themes that go along with the telling of their story seem somewhat to parallel Brahman of the Hindu tradition, Brahman and his consort Sarah. Let me see where I've got the name. It's a similar name to Sarah. It's Saraswati. So Abraham and Sarah and Brahman and Saraswati, they're kind of similar characters with similar sounding names from two different regions, but there's lots of parallels in the story and the telling. And of course, in the Anatolian region, we've got the sort of history of the possible landing place for Noah's Ark. And then further over to kind of India, where we get the Brahman kind of story, we also get the Vedic stories of like prior civilizations and floods, and like the Epic of Gilgamesh, stuff like this crops up. So I think there's like some kind of shared history and oral traditions and retelling of ancient stories that are probably all reaching to the same fundamental truth, but over so many thousands of years and so many generations, the modern day iterations in the different regions seem somewhat detached from one another. But if you dig deeper and deeper back into the history, I think they, you know, they seem to be coming from some common story. And if there's a common story that relates to lots of regions in the world somehow, then it relates to all of us, all people in all nations. We all share this planet and this earth, and we all somehow share some kind of common background or root if we go back far enough. So yeah, this is part of what inspires me to travel to ancient places and ancient civilizations and sites, just to sort of go and encounter it firsthand, because you can never get it fully from a book or from a screen, to go to places and sort of see it with your own eyes and smell it and taste it and touch the stones, feel the place, live it, make it part of your living encounter rather than something you just heard about. I feel like that, for me, that's very valuable, because I'm interested in where we come from. I'm interested in what the human experience is and what we're here for and why we're here and how we got here. And there's endless different ideas of what our origins are, between the very sort of cosmic notions of ancient civilizations and star beings or aquatic beings, or of course in the more academic narrative, we've got the sort of come up from the sort of primates and the monkeys. I don't really sit well with that story, but it's another part of the what's on the table. So I like to sort of entertain lots of ideas and sort of cross-reference between science and academia and history and mythology. And somewhere amongst it, there is a thread of truth, because we're here, somehow we got here.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's I mean, going back to Göbekli Tepe, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that the discovery of it by Klaus Schmidt, who was a German archaeologist in the 90s, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that that really kind of rewrote what we know about human history. So, can you kind of tell us about Göbekli Tepe to somebody that may not be into this kind of space that you and I are in? I mean, why is it so special?
Okay, so yeah, you mentioned Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist that first kind of discovered and excavated the site. I forget exactly when he discovered it, but it was relatively recent in the grand scheme of things, like in the recent decades. And what's incredible about Göbekli Tepe, like all over Europe and other parts of the world, we have all over the world, we had lots of ancient megaliths, but stone circles seem quite prevalent in UK and Europe and so on. Megalithic, sort of Neolithic stones and so on. And from the history we're generally told of the development of humanity, we're told that we were at some point we evolved from some kind of primate into, and eventually became more like human. And then we were like living wild, like hunter gatherers. And then we started to sort of build together communities and learn and develop and turn into this thing that we are now. And along that sort of generally accepted timeline before the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, it was generally thought that advanced sort of stone cutting skills and civilization and agriculture and the ability to sort of make like large scale stone structures, which requires like organization and workforce and organization of labor and feeding the workforce while they work and design. And, there's a lot to it. It's not like just something you just throw up a few stones. It's a very involved process. And so in the generally accepted narrative before the kind of addition of Göbekli Tepe into the story, it was thought that the more of what we call civilized humanity that built cities and more like worked of agriculture and so on dates back as early to perhaps 6,000 years ago with the ancient Sumerians around like Mesopotamia, Fertile Crescent, which is quite close to Göbekli Tepe, same kind of region. But yeah, that only dated back about 6,000 years. And prior to that, it was thought that everything was kind of a lot more simplistic. And of course, there are many anomalies in the world which evoke profound and deep questions about if that's really how far things go back. But nothing was officially accepted as earlier than that. Nothing major, megalithic, even though lots of people like to entertain ideas of stuff like Egyptian pyramids going back much further. There was no like hard evidence to support that. But where Klaus Schmidt discovered and excavated Göbekli Tepe, what he found was the portion that he's excavated that we can go and visit today is a couple of stone circles which comprise some very impressively cut stone pillars that are quite tall, very precision cut stone T-shaped pillars that are arranged in kind of stone circle formation. But they're a lot more like neat and precise and well cut than say Stonehenge, which is thought to be 4 or 5 or 6,000 years old, depending on if you're looking at the site or particularly the stones and so on. So you've got these stone circles that are made out of very precision cut T-pillars that not only are the pillars themselves very precise cut with like sort of neat edges and so on, they're not rough, they're dressed stone, but also on the surface of many of the pillars are relief carvings of various animals. And now if you were to etch, say if you were cutting a stone and you were going to etch an image of an animal into the surface of the stone, that would require a certain amount of skill and tools and ability. But a relief carving is where you've got a flat surface and the carved animal sits off of the, like in 3D off of the surface. So it's incredibly difficult to carve a piece of stone and leave the 3D animal on it while you're carving around it, I would imagine. I've not attempted it, but yeah, you know, you can imagine that's a lot more challenging. And so these things in any age would be, in any era would be impressive. You know, they're beautifully cut stone with these animals carved into some of them, relief carved onto some of them. But then you have the stone, precise cut stone pillars surrounded by enclosure walls that are made of less precise, kind of more rough cut little cobbly stone walls around the enclosures. And when Klaus Schmidt done some carbon testing, carbon dating from mortar that's found in the surrounding walls, the dates that come back between 10 and 12,000 years old, around 11,000, 11.5, depending on which bit was tested. But yeah, that kind of region of 11,000+ years old. And so the notion that we were kind of pretty basic and primitive and hunter-gatherers right up until the Sumerians, say in 6,000 years ago, suddenly that entire narrative is turned on its head, because suddenly we're like talking double the age of accepted civilization, and people were there doing very impressive stone cutting and erecting these big, heavy stone pillars, beautifully set. And what I'll add to that, not only does that in the official narrative, because that's the accepted official narrative, that it's that much older, not only that, there's a few other anomalies there. Also, there's evidence of like plant cultivation and early forms of agriculture that crop up there, which often agriculture seems to be pretty much always tied to kind of some kind of advanced stone cutting abilities and stellar observations. They all sort of go together with whoever was doing these things. They were also conducting agriculture. And so like the whole idea of how like agriculture's fundamentally essential to conduct civilization, because for there to be a civilized populace with division of workforce for different tasks, you need to be able to feed them. And if we're all hunter-gatherers, we're all running around doing all of the tasks, everyone's doing it. We're all chasing our food or whatever, or moving with the seasons, where the food goes, where the plants grow, so on. But to have a stable civilization in one location, you need agriculture, because then you can stay in one place instead of following the food sources with the season. You can stay put. And then if you've got some part of the population that specialise in agriculture, that can grow food in great abundance to feed far more people than themselves, then all of the other people that those agriculturalists are feeding are then freed up to explore other types of development and expression. So by introducing agriculture into a region, it facilitates and enables the possibility for higher learning, for studying the stars, and for developing crafts and skills and abilities and language and maths and, you know, like lots of stuff. If you're busy chasing your dinner every day, you're not going to have time for it, not to any great depth. But if you've got like a stable all year round food source that only a small portion of the population is providing, then everyone else is enabled to do other stuff, or even develop like forts and defences and train people to perhaps in the art of war, so that you can preserve and protect the thing that you've built. So all of that comes from agriculture, really, or it's fundamentally intertwined with it. And so when you see the supposed dawn of civilization 6,000 years ago, and then you find Göbekli Tepe, which is actually double the age, and they were cut in stone, large stone, very precisely cut, and they were conducting early forms of agriculture. And it doesn't seem to specifically have been a residential location, or it's not like there's not loads of like tombs or anything directly there. It seemed like some other kind of functional place, whether it was a training centre for agriculture and stellar observations. There are many theories about that. But it's such a huge monkey wrench in the works, big spanner in the works for the accepted narrative. And it is officially accepted as this much older. And like, instead of the academic world just sort of saying, putting a hand down and saying, okay, well, we thought civilization was that old, but, you know, hands up, we were wrong. It's been proven otherwise. It's gradually softening, of course, because of the way independent research is prevalent on the internet. But the general kind of response in the academic, or the very rigid end of the academic world, was, instead of to say, okay, well, we thought 12,000 years ago they were just hunter-gatherers and they were simple, but now we found these like incredible stonework and agriculture. Instead of saying, okay, well, clearly they were actually conducting civilization then, instead of saying that, they're like, oh, well, we can just reinterpret the definition of hunter-gatherer to include stonework and agriculture. And it's like, well, clearly you're not a hunter-gatherer if you're staying put and you're cutting stones and growing crops, you know. So they just kind of play with the terminology rather than biting the bullet and accepting they were wrong. In many cases, you know, I'm generalizing, of course. There are many open-minded academics as well, you know. But, you know, it's just, it strikes me as kind of a bit sad and a bit kind of comical as well. And it's kind of a shame because, you know, there's so much evidence for so many advanced things very far back in our history. And I think it's valuable to sort of take this on and acknowledge it and maybe share it to a wider audience within the academic world as well. Because, you know, like, we can't just sort of cling to an old idea that's been already proven wrong and just say, oh, well, you know, we believed that for a lot of years, so we're just going to hang on to it, you know, let it go. And I think the academic community would actually find we would receive a lot more interest and respect from a wider, younger audience if they were to be a bit more flexible and adapt to modern information as it comes out. They might sort of be sort of held in higher regard by a lot more people that way, because they would be seen to be growing with the evidence, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the
And so,
mainstream narrative that it was hunter-gatherers that created Göbekli Tepe is kind of silly. I mean, hunter-gatherers don't have the time to construct something on that scale. And like you were talking about with the stonework and everything, I think it's important to reiterate what you said. It's not that the animals and images are carved into the stone. The stone is actually carved away. So it's a 3D carving, and that takes, you know, advanced like techniques. And when I say advanced, I don't necessarily mean machine or like what we think of technology today, but it took a real understanding of like what they were doing, and that wasn't attributed to people 12,000 years ago. So that's, I think the stonework is really important to reiterate like how advanced it was for people at that time. And kind of going along those lines, I know like Pillar 43 specifically, which is one of the T-shaped pillars in the complex, is a probably the most famous as far as Göbekli Tepe goes. What is it about Pillar 43 that makes it so special and such like a wonder?
well, among all of the pillars that have been excavated, and I will add that there's a whole lot that's unexcavated, so we only see a very small portion of the site. So goodness knows what else is under the ground still. But of the bits that have been excavated, Pillar 43, I think it's in enclosure D, perhaps. So there's a few enclosures. Pillar 43 has quite an extensive amount of these relief carvings of animals and symbols, more so than any of the other widely known ones that have been like made available to the public eye, you know. And now there are a number of different interpretations of the images and the animals that are on Pillar 43. It's certainly fascinating because there are creatures on there like a vulture with a circle just above its wing, and below that there's like a scorpion. And then right at the top there's a couple of like three rectangles in a row with like little arches on the top of them. And there are lots of interpretations of what they might mean. And so I'll mention briefly a couple of the interpretations and then comment on that. So one of the more popular ideas is that the images represent very early representations of stellar phenomena, like what we would call in the modern day sort of astrological signs, because there's a scorpion on there and it looks very much like a modern day astrological Scorpio symbol. And then and there have been people like archaeoastronomers that have like mapped the sort of star maps onto the images, you know, like overlaid them to see what lines up. And so to sort of cut to the chase with it, what they imply, the people that go down that route that have done the studies, they suggest that what we're looking at is an ancient map of the sky from about a map of what it looks like from that location about 13,000 years ago, just before the end of the last ice age, just the sort of like end of the sort of catastrophic period that the Younger Dryas, as many people would have heard of through many researchers, this period where there was like a sudden end to the ice age and, you know, the world transformed massively, and there was a major catastrophe or series of catastrophes over a time period. And so following that kind of line of research, they suggest that it was kind of almost like a memorial of like, oh, this crazy stuff happened in the sky between these stars, these motions, and we captured it on the stone and made this stone circle that then the stone pillars seem possibly to align to various stellar movements. So with that theory, it suggested that it was a map of the sky during or around the time of the catastrophe. And perhaps what people attach onto that theory is that perhaps it's like a sort of preemptive kind of warning of a repetitive cycle that, oh, you know, like when the sky looks like that, beware, because it might come round again. You know, if it's, say, a comet hitting the Earth, we might go through the asteroid belt again, or the comet. You know, like there's a lot that goes with that story. And I will say, with that overlaying the star map over the symbols that are on the pillar, there does seem to be quite a lot of agreeable correlations there. So I do quite like that theory. I'm not attached to it, but I think it's one of the better ones, that because I do believe the ancient people were very interested in what was happening in the skies, in the heavens, in the stars, with the sun and the moon, all of their motions. And of course, if we're to assume that people didn't have artificial lighting 12,000 years ago, which they probably didn't, at least not in any fashion that we're aware of, then the night skies would have been like incredibly bright and vivid for everyone everywhere in the world, because when the sun went down, the sky would be dark. You would have had, apart from flames and candles, you know, you would have had lots of darkness. And for anyone who likes getting out of towns and cities and into the wilderness, yourselves included, you know, like obviously if you're far from any town or city, you get a completely different idea of what the sky is. You know, like when you see the stars away from light pollution, they're a fundamental, incredible part of our experience if we go and look. But a lot of people miss that in the modern world because of artificial lighting. So I think people that live a lot in towns and cities perhaps might be more inclined to dismiss the significance and the relevance of the cosmic and stellar movements for ancient people, because in the old times, you know, the night sky would have been a phenomenal sight for everyone everywhere, pretty much. So I do like that theory that it's some kind of reference to the sky. There's another theory that at the top of the pillar, where you get three rectangles that have got like semicircles above them, there's another theory that suggests that it might be somehow referencing a solar calendar, and that the three semicircles would represent the winter solstice, the equinox, and the summer solstice, the sort of extremities of the solar motion and the middle point. And while I think people monitoring and recording solar and lunar motions in ancient architecture, I think that is a thing in lots of places. But in this particular occasion, I don't really like that theory, because although the idea of a solar calendar could well be somewhere in place there, the actual images of the rectangles and the semicircles, they don't really look sun-like to me. So I don't really feel that doesn't really sit well with me personally. You know, it could be right, but for me, it doesn't sit that well. And interestingly, these three rectangles with semicircles, they look a lot more like what people call the handbag symbol, which crops up all over the ancient world on stone carvings and relief carvings, you know. And for anyone that isn't familiar with that, you know, like in all parts of the ancient world, we see these strange, sometimes winged characters with what looks like a handbag in one hand and perhaps a pine cone in the other, or some offering, you know. And lots of people talk about them being handbags. But there are, if you look in certain museums around the world, you see there are stone objects that are like a chunk of stone with a curved handle, and it looks more like a weight or some kind of, it's not a bag, you know, it doesn't have a hole inside. So I think what's represented on many of the stone carvings that people call handbags perhaps weren't bags at all. Perhaps they didn't have anything inside. They were perhaps these chunks of stone with a semicircle handle, and they might have served as something if we consider ancient advanced technology that's very different from our own, the interplay of certain types of stone at certain locations might have somehow, these stone objects that were like a chunk of stone with a semicircle handle might have somehow interacted with sacred sites as some kind of electromagnetic transducer or something, or some means for the initiated individual to interact with a site by means of some kind of stone implement. I don't know, just because the stone things do exist in museums, but the things on the Pillar 43 look more like the handbags than they do images of the sunshine.
Hmm.
But of course, because a lot of the symbols are animals of one sort or another, lots of kind of serpentine sort of symbolism and creatures that look four-legged creatures or birds of various sorts and scorpions and so on. I think there's also a very real possibility that they could be depictions of some kind of shamanic visionary experience. Anyone who's read about or experimented with plant medicines, be it ayahuasca or peyote or dimethyltryptamine in some form, or, there's different parts of the world have different kinds of mind-altering substances that have been used for tens of thousands of years in a shamanic, tribal, natural setting. And I think they're fundamentally part of the human story, even though they're in the modern civilized world, they are generally demonized by the authorities. I think they've played a fundamental part in our past, and perhaps the lack of them being kind of officially sanctioned in the present is a real loss for us in the modern world. But that aside, I
Hmm.
think, and I'm not the only person to say this. This is my own thoughts, but also stuff that I've researched and studied about Göbekli Tepe and other sites. The idea that some of the animals could be something that was perceived or encountered through some kind of altered visionary state by the ingestion of plant medicines, or even just like light deprivation or sun gazing or deep meditation. It doesn't only require plant medicine to go into an altered state. There are many ways and means, breath work and various things. But yeah, anyone familiar with visionary states, or if you look at any literature or artwork from people that explore visionary states, you see a lot of kind of animal symbolism and strange creatures. And of course, in many shamanic traditions, they speak of spirit animals as well, where the initiated shamanic kind of individual would somehow learn to merge mind or spirit or soul with some specific animal that they identified with as their spirit animal or their familiar, where they might kind of mentally psychedelically merge with, say, an eagle or a vulture, and then have the experience of flying in a vision, stuff like that. I feel like there's every chance that there's something like that related to the animal symbols on Pillar 43.
Yeah. So, getting to some of the more, I guess, modern controversies, I've heard this talked online at length by guys like Jimmy Corsetti and others. What are your thoughts on and I think we briefly talked about this before we started recording, but the dome enclosure that's kind of over Göbekli Tepe at the moment. I know they put the poles and everything to like hold up the enclosure down into the site itself. So there's some controversy surrounding that, and then there's also controversy with some olive trees that were planted on this site. What are your thoughts on those things?
So yeah, before I get specifically into the kind of deeper connotations, experiential level, I much prefer to go to a site that doesn't have loads of modern infrastructure. So I'll preempt that for any site. Like when I went to Göbekli Tepe, I got the taxi ride up to the visitor centre, and then you could go to the visitor centre where there's lots of stuff to buy, like lots of trinkets and, like entry through the gift shop. And then you park up in the car park, go through the place to get your ticket and the gift shop, and then you have to go walk around some modern kind of walkways and go and queue up for a little shuttle bus. And they have like a rotation of shuttle buses that drive you up to the actual site. And as I mentioned earlier on, it was cold weather and I was unprepared. So I was freezing cold, and it was very damp and misty and like light rain when I was up there, which added to the mystical kind of vibe of the place at a personal level, but it was not very practical. And so instead of just like wandering up to the site directly, I had to like wait around for this little shuttle bus to then drive me up to the place and then get out. So I don't tend to like that kind of like multi-layered infrastructure that you have to like go through to navigate to a site. I'd rather just go to the thing and have a look at it. Whilst anyone who's interested in any kind of like ancient history or prehistory, of course, Göbekli Tepe is definitely a place that I'd recommend going to for anyone with any vague interest in that, because it's so fundamental to our sort of deeper history as a species that, that should surely matter to majority of people. But to go there, because of the way it's laid out, I found that although the site itself was incredible, I felt like I couldn't really get as close as I wanted to the actual ancient stones, because the stones have been excavated out of the hill. So they're a little bit below the modern day surface. And of course, something else we touched upon perhaps before we started the recording was that the bit that we look at today is only a very small portion of the entire site. The site was all buried intentionally so 8 or 10,000 years ago, which is another mystery as well. But the part that's been excavated that we are allowed to look at makes up for maybe 5 or 10% of the entire site. And the entire site, in the span of it, under this like large mountainous hill, the entire site is said to be about 50 times the size of Stonehenge in England, which is ludicrous, but we're only seeing like 5 or 10% of it. So there's all this incredible stuff that they've scanned it, and there's loads and loads of more stone circles under this big hill. And so the little bit they've excavated, they've built this like wooden walkway around the side of it that just makes a lap round it. And it overlooks down into the excavation. So you can't get down close to the stones. You're up above at an elevated vantage point, which does mean you can see across the site, but you can't get close to anything, which I found kind of disappointing. It's a long way to go to not be able to quite get that last little few meters, So I was having to zoom in a bit with my camera to see some of the relief carvings, which I felt would have been a lot nicer to see close up and see the three-dimensional kind of nature of them. And then there's this kind of strangely shaped stone roof, which is a real eyesore. It's like contemporary modern design gone wrong, like really ugly and just,
Yeah, it
it
looks
looks
like
like
a
a real
potato
eyesore
chip.
on the mountainside or the hillside. So like, I wouldn't like to see that structure anywhere, let alone over the most incredible ancient site known to man. It just seems like such a shame. And as you said, not only is that kind of over the site, which, like, it's not confirmed, but lots of people say that the T-shaped stone pillars are aligned to specific stellar movements, star movements, But with a roof over the entire thing, even if you could get into the stone circle, you can't look at the sky above it because it's covered. And of course, they need to find ways to preserve and protect the things. But I think the way they've gone about it, personally, I don't like it. I love the Turkish people and I love visiting there. But whoever designed that thing, I don't think they were having a good day, not through my lens. And then I actually touched on the metal framework that the thing's supported by. It appears that they've just drilled straight down into parts of the unexcavated site, probably damaging some of this stuff that they haven't excavated yet. I know that's the case at some of the other sites. You mentioned Jimmy Corsetti, and he's done quite a lot of work specifically on the unfortunate mishandling of the sites by people that do just drill down into unexcavated parts of 12,000-year-old sites to put up a structure to protect the site. And it's like, well, you're not really protecting it, are you? Because you've just damaged it to build the thing. So yeah, I don't think the motivations for the way they've gone about that are presented in a very honest way, because if they genuinely cared about the site, that would not be the way to approach it. And so it's not been done with true care and attention for the antiquity of the site. It's been done either to just knock up a visitor centre where they can cash in. There's definitely an element of that at any of these sites, because, it's not surprising that if there's like a really attractive, popular thing that tourists are going to come and see, of course they're going to want to earn from the tourism, and I can't knock them for that. But the way they've gone about it, it's very slapdash at best, and at worst, it kind of, if you go down sort of Jimmy Corsetti's kind of mindset a bit more with it, it seems like a very intentional thing to kind of block ancient historical findings that upset the apple cart and upturn the official narrative, because of course the higher up you get into the sort of society with the people with the most sway and power in sort of governments and official bodies and people with the biggest money, a lot of these people, at least in their family lines or in their sort of business association lines, they're all intertwined with the education system and the sort of universities and the funding and the sciences and so on. And so they've got a hand in lots of the things that would be upturned if we got the full story of a much more ancient civilization history. Like it would affect a lot of the people that are in a position to block these things. So I do feel somewhat suspicious as the way they handle the site. And then additionally, as I said, that only about 5 or 10% of the entire site's been excavated. And it's said to have been intentionally buried like 8 or 10,000 years ago. But if that's so, if it's been sat buried for 8 or 10,000 years, and they've excavated a small portion, and then the official sort of take on it now is like, okay, well, we're not going to excavate the rest of it for another 150 years, where everyone that exists in the modern world today will be dead and gone, and it'll be our great grandkids or, so no one in the entire world that's alive today will ever live to see the excavations of the later part if they ever happen. So that seems ludicrous. If it's been buried for 8 or 10,000 years, I don't think we need to wait any longer till we're all dead to find out what's in it. It seems like a very deliberate way to sort of suppress any further upsetting of the official narrative, because it's already upset it. So if we dig deeper, it's only going to reveal more. And of course, there's stuff images of stuff that you're not allowed to go and see as a tourist. Other things that have been excavated there, other pillars with other carvings on. And so, did you see the kind of rectangular thing that looks like it has two kind of bathtub kind of things in a big chunk of stone with scoop marks in it? That was excavated there, and it looks like something very functional. And it brought to mind like Jeffrey Drum's Land of Chem. I can imagine I don't know if he's done anything on Göbekli Tepe, but I can imagine through his lens that these stone sort of rectangular things that are cut out of this big chunk might well have involved some kind of chemical use or production or something. Definitely not the kind of hunter-gatherers just playing around with stone on a whim. There's something vastly different going on there. And then, of course, there are a couple of other things with the Göbekli Tepe as well. The carbon dates that give us the approximately 11 to 12,000 year old dates of the site. You can't date stone directly because carbon date requires some kind of organic material to be tested. And so if you can't test the stone directly, all of the precision cut stone pillars with the carvings on can't be tested directly. So the dates that were given, where you've got the stone T-shaped pillars making the stone circles, you have like an enclosure wall around each enclosure that's made of much smaller stones that are more rough cut and just cobbled together into making an enclosure wall, which is nowhere near as well crafted as the pillars themselves. And amongst the stones that make up these little rough cut enclosure walls include some fragments of broken T-shaped pillars where the site must have already been old enough for parts of it to be eroded and broken and damaged. And then the people that have built the stone wall enclosures have used bits of the broken T-pillars to make the enclosures. So they look, I'm pretty certain of the fact, they look like someone else built them, or it was a later addition to build the enclosure walls, because they're completely different build and they've got fragments of broken T-pillars in them. And the carbon dates that tell us it's at least 11 or so thousand years old come from the mortar in the enclosure walls, which I think are a much later addition than the original site. So, the more you look into it, the more the mystery deepens. So I suspect that at least parts of the site potentially could go back much further than we know. But of course, if we're not going to excavate it for another 3 or 4 generations, we'll never know. You and I will never know,
Yeah, did I hear you say that the carbon dating was from the outer ring and they haven't actually done more carbon dating kind of to the inner rings?
Well, they're carbon dates from the enclosure walls that surround the T-pillars. So you have like a series of precision cut big stones with the carvings on, and then like a little wall that surrounds each enclosure, and the carbon dates were from the smaller walls. And they're very basic in comparison to the T-pillars. They look like someone just threw them up. They're very irregular and rubbly, and they contain fragments of broken T-pillars in them. So they seem like a much later addition to me. And that's where the carbon dates were taken from, and from some charcoal from the site as well, which, like you could go there today and burn something, you put the charcoal down and they could carbon date it and say, oh, well, the site's like a day old because that's what the carbon tells us, like it doesn't tell you how old the site is, because the site is made of stone and carbon date comes from organic material. So yeah, I strongly suspect that the site goes back at least significantly further, maybe much, much further if we were to dig the whole thing up.
Yeah, we know that
Um,
by carbon dating, we know that the site was there at that time, but that doesn't tell us how long it had been there. It was essentially the issue with carbon dating is you can't really tell from carbon dating because, like you said, you can only carbon date organic material. So, who knows how long the stones were actually there? And that's kind of the issue, and the same issue that you see in Egypt when they carbon date like the pyramids and things like that.
and also, like, Göbekli Tepe was the first groundbreaking thing to change the narrative. And then, like, soon after, they found, just down the road, they found Karahan Tepe, which has got a lot of kind of
Hmm.
similarities to, it's clearly from the same general populace that make the thing, even though there are some fundamental differences. There's a lot of parallels, and it's of a similar age, if not a little older. But since the finding of Karahan Tepe, there have been countless more sites discovered in the same region, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of these T-pillars strewn around the landscape, just buried, waiting to be excavated. So I suspect it was an entire sort of, I don't know if civilization's quite the right word, but it was a very large area with lots of structures that all had these T-pillars, like the ones at Göbekli Tepe, and loads of them, hundreds of them, are like over a many-mile area. They're still buried, as well as some that are partially excavated. So while Göbekli Tepe is the kind of the well-known site, as time's moving forward, they just keep finding more and more and more. And I don't know if you know an ancient history presenter named Johanna James, like lady from
Uh-huh.
London. I listen to quite a lot of her videos as well. And she brought to my attention in one of the videos that, like, if you look at the carvings and the T-pillars at Göbekli Tepe, you got this pillar and you got this kind of thing with the hands around the waist.
Hmm.
As part of the car pillar. So it's some kind of, even though they're like not human-like, they're like some kind of creature with arms and hands, And then there's symbols on the back of the pillar, which would be the back of the person with the hands. Well, when they've excavated the Moai statues on Easter Island, and they've found that they're not just the Moai heads, that many of them have got bodies that go like tens of feet down into the ground. They also have their hands around their bellies in the same way as the pillars that go back to Tepe. And they also have lots of similar symbols carved onto the back of the ones on Easter Island, which is obviously the other side of the world in the middle of the Pacific. It's
Uh-huh.
and there are other statues in like Java and in Indonesia and Sumatra, and also in Peru, the Cloud People statues. There's lots of statues, ancient stone statues around the world that have the same formation of hands around the waist, and in many cases, similar faces or similar symbols on the back. So it's just yet another evidence of commonalities between seemingly distant populations that are far away in time and space. And so it doesn't give us any answers, but it certainly brings up a lot of interesting questions and just keeps upturning and upturning the official story. There's so much incredible mystery in the world, in the ancient world. And, like, of course, we'll never have all the answers, and I don't need all the answers. I just love the mystery, and I find it so fascinating. It's a great reason to travel and go and explore. And so when I visited Göbekli Tepe, I'd gone up there in the cab and driven up to the mountain where it is and had my time there. And I had every intention of going straight on to Karahan Tepe. So we drove for however long, it's perhaps an hour's drive away or something like that. We drove all the way up to Karahan Tepe, only to find that it was closed, which was a pity, because I only had to sort of stay there, and that was like one of the places I would love to have seen. But apparently they'd had a very small kind of mudslide that had filled in a little bit of the Karahan Tepe site when I was there at the beginning of February, and they said that they were going to have it cleared by the end of the month, and I'm sure they have, and it's been open since. So I was a little bit deflated on the day when I couldn't go in Karahan Tepe, but I did think it gives me every reason to return to Turkey, because it's definitely somewhere I need to explore more. But while I was there also, we mentioned Haran earlier. Haran is relatively close by for a same day visit as Göbekli Tepe. Haran's got a lot of interesting history as a sort of settlement and a city, and it's famed for a very ancient university that was from the sort of Islamic Golden Age many thousands of years ago. And it's famed for kind of beehive mud houses and beehive-shaped mud houses. But the university there, it was particularly popular over like maybe 1.5 to 2,500 years ago as a kind of stellar observatory kind of centre where there were towers to watch the stars and the planets. And there was a reverence for the Mesopotamian moon god named Sin, which was in that location. So I went there, I was fascinated with that. And there's one remaining tower that's a little bit damaged, but still standing amongst the ruins of this ancient university at Haran. And there's no like ticket booth or fence or guard. There's just local people that come and say hi and sort of offer you a bit of guidance if you want it. But very interesting to see. I found it fascinating because the solitary observation tower that's still standing there, it looks very much like the image of the traditional tower card in the tarot deck. And so there are many people that think that the traditional Rider-Waite tarot image of the tower was inspired by this tower in Haran. And it's not a hard fact, it's just an interesting anomaly in the story. So I went there with that in mind, and it was a beautiful place to see. And then very nearby to Haran, maybe 30 miles or so, another short drive in the cab, is another site which I'd wanted to see for a great many years. It's scarcely known, called Soğmatar. And so Soğmatar is up in the mountain, and there's not a great deal left to see there today. It's a lot of ruins, but Soğmatar goes back many thousands of years as well. And what's there, or what was there, was a big central mound or ziggurat. People even speculate possibly a pyramid, but some kind of large central structure, which was the main structure, surrounded by 7 towers, smaller towers around it, around the mountain. And again, the Mesopotamian moon god Sin was revered there. And so the central ziggurat or mound or structure was said to be dedicated to the moon god Sin. And then each of the 7 towers surrounding that were dedicated to each of the visible heavenly bodies, the planets, the sun and the moon and the visible planets. And so I went up there, and that again had no ticket booth, no fences, no guards. There were just some local kids running around, and like I gave a little bit of money to the cab driver to give to the kids, just so that they'd be happy with us wandering about. And there's wild dogs running around. It's really beautiful up there. And I wandered around. The cab driver just hung out with the local kids and just sort of like had a laugh with them while I was wandering around the mountain. And there's remnants of lots of buildings and bits of the towers, and you could see a bit of the original mound in the centre, but you can't really tell what it used to be. And there's lots of underground tombs which have got like 3-dimensional carvings into the bedrock, which reminded me like some of the underground tombs carved into the Giza Plateau in their style, although they're very eroded. And that was an incredible place to see, very unusual. And there's a couple of things as well. There were around 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, the group that was there at that point, even though the site was already ancient, the people that were in that region then were known as the Sabians, which the word Sabian means star watcher. And that's why they have all these. Soğmatar is a very little known place, but it's incredible. It's beautiful up there. And it's got some fascinating history with it. And Moses is said to have spent some time there, thought to have spent some time there after the Exodus from Egypt. So, it's got a lot of, this whole region's got a lot of like connotations with like biblical narrative. And, aside from the actual structures themselves, the stories that accompany them really fascinate me.
So what would you say as far as visiting these different sites in Turkey, I mean, I know just from like being at certain places around the world, it's like very set up for tourism and people visiting to go to these different ancient sites and stuff. Like, what is the actual like getting to these places like? I mean, is it just a lot of driving through the desert? Is it set up for tourists at this point, or is it still pretty far out there?
I mean, all the places I went to were quite a way out in the middle of nowhere, sort of like desolate kind of mountainous or very hilly regions, and just driving off for like 50 miles or 100 miles or so in this direction or that. And then between the sites, the same kind of thing. There was scarcely anything between the sites, just like nothing anywhere. And as I mentioned earlier on, I was just in a regular taxi on the meter just because that was like, I hadn't made any plans. I just turned up and saw what happened. So it cost me a small fortune to get around in the cab, but it was kind of fun because it was just me and the driver. So instead of getting, I would imagine from a nearby city like San Lerfe, you can probably get onto some kind of like coach or bus with other tourists to go to some of the main sites, like Göbekli Tepe. I would imagine so because they're pushing that for tourism. But places like Haran and Soğmatar, they're not really popular enough. No one really knows about them. So you just drive out into the middle of nowhere and use the GPS. If it works in the mountains, it doesn't always. And you just turn up there and they're surprised to see you because they're just locals living about and that's just where they live and there aren't any tourists. So for someone who was choosing to go there, it's very much a case for the lesser known sites of just finding either hiring a car or finding a driver or a minibus or something that will just sort of suit your personal needs, but you won't easily find anything predetermined for that. But as I say, I'm sure you would for Göbekli Tepe because it's like a major site. But yeah, it's like
Yeah.
Soğmatar and Haran. It's just like you just turn up.
So for those sites, you mentioned they're just kind of like in the towns themselves. Is there a lot less or if probably no modern structures like at Göbekli Tepe or Göbekli Tepe for those sites?
Yeah, there's scarcely anything there. It's just like in the middle of nowhere, really. They're not like in a town or a city. They're just like, you just drive out into the desolate kind of nothing and suddenly you're at a site. There were a handful of locals living by Soğmatar, but I didn't actually see a town there, not even a town. There were just like a couple of little dwellings. So I don't know how these people get by. They obviously must have something more going on nearby for supplies and resources. And at Haran, there were a small community there that were living in some modern dwellings, but the bit that I saw seemed very kind of basic. I'm not sure. I think there was a bit more at Haran than I saw. But yeah, for a lot of it, and there are lots of other sites I'd like to get to over there that I didn't have time for, but there's quite a lot there that's just completely in the middle of nowhere. And so for someone who's a bit adventurous, it's kind of a good time to go because with Soğmatar, there's no fence and there's no barrier and there's no guard or guides or any hassle at all. So you just have the place to yourself, which is a real incredible way to have the experience, And one other place I went to on my last day was a city named Gaziantep, and it's known to be one of, if not the oldest continuously populated city on earth. It was a Neolithic settlement which grew into a town, which grew into a city. And it's been continuously inhabited for over 10,000 years. And in the modern day, it's a proper city, And so that was an interesting place to go. And I didn't even know about it before I got there. The driver suggested that we go there because we had a bit of time, even though it was like 100 miles in another direction. So I was like, yeah, let's do it, So we went to Gaziantep. And I was only there for a short while, so I didn't really explore. But the place itself it's been continuously populated for over 10,000 years, and it was like a major hub for the Silk Road, trading hub. And it sort of started out as an early Neolithic settlement, or possibly even earlier than that. But then over the many millennia, it's been home to the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and many others. And there's like a kind of big kind of outcrop of stone in the middle, which had some dwellings carved into it, which later down the millennia had then other buildings built on top of it and like eventually a fortress built on top of it. So when you go there today, it's like kind of like a castle fortress on top of a rough cut rock that's got rooms in it. I didn't go inside because I was only there for a short visit, but I just had a good look around. And the fortress there is a couple of thousand years old, but the bit under it, the base of it, has been in use for many thousands of years as like the main kind of fortress or central kind of point in the city. So something I'd like to explore more. But, there's just so much around that part of Turkey. And there are parts of Turkey not that far away that I would love to have seen, which I didn't have the time or the scope for at the time. Like there's a researcher that I don't really follow so much called Matthew LaCroix. I'm not particularly into his work, but I'm aware of it. But something that he brought to my attention, which I'm very interested in, is Lake Van, however you pronounce that, which is a little further east than Göbekli Tepe. And there's stuff under the water, which is many thousands of years old, like megalithic stuff. And also around the periphery of it, I know he's doing tours there now, Matthew LaCroix, of like, there's a place on the northern coast shore of the Lake Van called Kef Kalesi, which is like, looks like something Egyptian with like huge basalt precision cut rectangular blocks that are all polished, stuff like that. So there's a lot to see in Turkey, you know, so I think they keep finding more stuff. And another one that he brought to my attention is Zanaki Tepe, which again is in the same kind of region, southeastern Turkey. And Zanaki Tepe, as well as having kind of stuff that's familiar to the region and cuneiform inscriptions on the walls, there's also some polygonal stonework there, megalithic polygonal stonework, which looks like something straight out of South America. And of course, in South America and also in Easter Island, you know, there's like these correlations between the statues and the carvings and then the polygonal walls that crop up in Easter Island and South America and in southeastern Turkey and at Zanaki Tepe. So the more they find, the more the crossovers keep linking and linking and linking. So yeah, it's very fascinating what's already known there in Turkey. And of course, they seem to be finding stuff faster than I can keep up with it. Like every time you look online, there's another very ancient site that's been found there, you know. So yeah, definitely somewhere to explore more. And just to reiterate something I touched on earlier, although I didn't really go to many touristy places and I didn't stay in a touristy place, I did find it incredibly warm and friendly and welcoming. So as like a solo mission, it was like that was very, very lucky to find a place that was, you know, I just felt really happy to be there night and day. So yeah, I'll definitely be returning to Turkey, but preferably in warmer weather.
Yeah. It sounds like a real fascinating place, and it sounds like somewhere that anybody, especially that's into, I guess, the kind of stuff we're into, ancient history, ancient civilizations, or anybody that's just interested in prehistory, it's like kind of on the same level, I'd say, as Egypt, where it's kind of the Mecca. It's like, I think in years to come, Göbekli Tepe and a lot of these other sites around Turkey will be like a must go to place, you know. But it sounds like you had a really good time, and I really love seeing your content, your photos, and the videos and stuff. So yeah, it's definitely somewhere that I want to visit for sure.
Yeah, and so cool
Fantastic,
that,
yeah.
you kinda just went there on a whim, 48 hours before you went was when you decided to go, and, that's we kinda have a debate, it comes up every now and then about, like, itineraries or just kind of winging it and, finding, like, the in between, but the good part and the positive thing that comes out from just kind of, like, just doing the thing, just going out and figuring it out as you go is you learn about certain things, like you've mentioned, about these other places that you can go to next time.
Right.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. And I like to consider as well, you know, in the modern world, it's very easy for people to travel to faraway locations, and we can do lots of online research, and we can see videos and footage and photos and all kinds of information from the internet and from books and libraries. You know, there's so much available. So if you choose to, you can see a lot before you go somewhere. But I like to
Yeah.
consider back like a few generations back before the innovation of cameras, photography, color printing, or anything like that, that not that many generations ago, like our great, great, great grandparents, if they'd gone off on an adventure, all they would have had to go on was some possibly text in a couple of books and a few illustrations from some wild adventure that went off to some faraway land and tried to come back and describe it, you know. And it would have been like treacherous and challenging and, you know, like hard to navigate. And to go off to like Turkey or Egypt from the UK where I am, a couple of hundred years ago, it probably would have been weeks and weeks in a boat somewhere and people getting sick on the boat and getting like attacked by bandits on the way on the land and all kinds of stuff. And now I can just like click online and be on the flight 2 days later. You know, I like to remember the value of where we are in the modern world, of what's available to us. And not everyone makes use of what's available to us in the modern world. We've got so much freedom if we learn how to engage with it right. And so I like to sort of make the best of what's available to me. But I also like, on the occasion of going to Turkey, because I just went with no plan and no context, apart from wanting to see a couple of sites. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And that's part of my motivation for that, is to think, like, we didn't always have this kind of like comfort blanket of how we live in the world. And I like to go out and just do something on my own, far away in another country, with no plan and no contact. And, like, chances are I'll make it through and I'm back here and I can tell you the story. And I think that for me, that feels a lot more exciting than having something overly planned with a predetermined, preconceived notion of what's going to happen before it happens. Although there is obviously room for planning. And if I go with other people traveling, or if I host a tour, like when I do my tours to Egypt, for example, of course you have to have a plan and an itinerary, because you're dealing with other people that have got hopes and dreams and expectations to meet, But as a solo traveler, it's only me that I can let myself down if I make an error. And I'm completely happy with that. I'm happy to just sort of wing it and see what happens, because, like, what's the worst can happen? I might get caught out and get like lose my money or be a bit cold or something silly, like, I can live with live with the consequence of my own lack of planning if I'm not imposing it on others. So yeah, I think it adds to the sense of adventure, and it brings me a lot more vividly into my alertness and my senses if I've got no plan and I'm just like put into a brand new environment where people don't speak the same language as me, and I've just got to make it work. And then, and I've come away with a great experience, and, like, I'm really pleased. I had no regrets in any of what I chose to do there, and I'd definitely go again.
Awesome.
Yeah, there's no sense of like autopilot. You're always engaged because you don't have a plan. So you're always engaged in the moment of like, okay, I'm here. And then, what's my next decision?
Right. Yeah. Speaking of Egypt tours, do you want to let people kind of know about that, the tour you're planning for Egypt, and then also like where any listener can find you on social media and your different, do a shameless plug.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I shall. So over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been hosting and co-hosting group tours to Egypt, and focusing mainly on ancient history, taking people to temples and pyramids and tombs, but also a bit of exploring the modern culture and the markets and the bazaars, and taking people out on the Red Sea occasionally for snorkeling or diving, because there's like beautiful coral reef and tropical fish and so on. And so I've got the next tour in the diary is actually quite soon. We usually have a lot more time planning a tour, so it's a bit of a kind of, it was a little bit of a last minute thing of like, oh yeah, we can do another tour this year. So we've got a tour planned this coming September, which will happen over the course of the autumn equinox. The tour is an 11-day, 10-night tour from the 17th of September to the 27th of September. And what it will comprise is, we'll start out in Cairo, staying in Giza, in the Giza area. We'll be there for 4 nights, and we'll have like a full day at Saqqara and Memphis. For Saqqara's for the Step Pyramid and the pyramids of Gwinas and Teti, where the Egyptian Book of the Dead originate from the inscriptions on the walls of the pyramids. Also the Serapeums at Saqqara, famous underground labyrinth with these 100-ton boxes. And nearby Memphis, where there's an open-air museum with like a huge statue of Ramses, and the second largest single-piece Sphinx is there as well. We'll also go to the new Egyptian Grand Egyptian Museum, which I haven't been to myself yet. I'm excited for that because it's meant to be all whistles and bells, And then we'll have a full day at the Giza pyramids to explore. There's lots to see there, of course. And I'll be, while we're in Cairo, I'll be doing a slideshow, a talk and presentation about the mysteries of the pyramids, sharing with the group some of the things that they won't find in many books or online, some of the lesser known facts, as well as some of the known stuff, but, like deepening the mystery a bit before we go and have a look at the stuff. And we'll also get time to sort of explore some of the modern day culture, go to a huge market and like bazaar and check out some local cuisine. Then we'll fly down south to Luxor. We'll check out Karnak Temple, Luxor Temple, Valley of the Kings for the royal tombs, and a few other temples, Medinet Habu and so on. A bit of time like on boats on the Nile, like sunset on a sailboat with some food for the evening, stuff like that. And then we'll make the journey by and the equinox will happen then as well, this autumn equinox. And then we'll travel by aircon minibus across the desert over to the east coast to Hurghada. And we're going to have a day in Soma Bay where we're going to be like beachside at a nice location, and we'll have the option of snorkeling in a coral reef with the tropical fish, or as an optional add-on, if people want to actually dive there, then we could facilitate that as well if we get an audience that wants that. So yeah, that's this September. And in terms of where to find me online, mainly that would be with Facebook and Instagram. With Facebook, it's Mysteries Cool, which is Mysteries as a singular, so that's MYSTERYS, and then second word Cool, COOL. Yeah, Mysteries Cool. So that's a play on words for mystery school, you know. And then on Instagram, it's the same thing, mysteries.cool on there. And my name obviously will come up on here, Vincent Kane. So you can find Vincent Kane Mystery School on Instagram. And so all the details of tours and past tours and my adventures and travels are all on there. And then like over the coming months, I want to expand a little bit on YouTube as well. I've only got one video from a few years ago on YouTube, which again, that's as Mysteries Cool as well on the YouTube channel. But I want to start adding some content on there now as well, because, you know, like it's a different kind of platform to work with. And yeah, so that's the general plan at the moment. I'm also considering, I'm just sort of penciling together a tour of Mexico for next springtime, because I spent some time there last March, which was really beautiful. Mexico, Yucatan, for pyramids and nature, you know, like, yeah, that's a whole nother story. But yeah, I'm considering I think I'm going to do maybe a practice run of a tour in Mexico with some friends in March to see how it works logistically before I sort of advertise it as a saleable product for the public, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very cool. We're planning to go to Yucatan this year in October. My first time, obviously not Jared's first time, so we're excited to do that.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
if you carry on. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to mention that. Yeah, I know next year in Egypt, there's going to be a total eclipse happening, I believe in April. So I think, and it's going to be like the longest eclipse of all time. I think it's going to be like totality of 6 minutes or something. So I know that a lot of people are going to be on the Giza Plateau for that in April. So it's going to be a really busy time next year. Yeah.
It's actually in August, Jared. Yeah, it's on the 2nd of August. So that's like exactly a year today, funnily enough.
Oh, wow. It's in August.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other A.
2nd of August. Yeah, funny.
I got my A months mixed up.
Yeah, but it's literally, it's the 2nd of August today, right, when we're recording. So it's exactly a year today.
Wow.
And so, yeah, we've got we're hosting an Egypt tour for the solar eclipse as well. That's going to be a 12-day tour with an optional add-on for Red Sea diving. And that'll be Cairo for pyramids, Aswan for temples and swimming in the Nile, and Luxor for the temples and for the actual eclipse. And yeah, indeed, it's going to be the longest full solar eclipse for the next century or more. So
yeah,
6 minutes something totality blackout. So for anyone to have that encounter anywhere is like, you know, it's the longest one for the next century. So it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. But to be able to see that, I think the best places in the world to see it is in central Egypt. So we're going to be in Luxor for that. So we'll get a full 100% blackout for that 6 minutes. And yeah, what better place to do it in the heart of Egypt? It brings to mind the lyrics from that old song, The Total Eclipse of the Heart. You know, it's like the heart of Egypt, and we're going to get an eclipse there, you know. So yeah, I'm really excited for that.
Awesome.
So yeah, it's a year today, funnily enough. I hadn't thought of that until you brought it up.
Wow, exactly 1 year. Wow. Interesting. Yeah, we were talking about possibly doing Egypt next year also. And I don't know, we were looking at some different dates, but I think it's going to be busy, but I think that would be a cool time to go. You know, be hot though.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys want to come to Egypt with me at any time, I can sort of we could work something out as a something more bespoke, personalised for you. And if you had any friends, we could come to some arrangement and do you a sort of special deal. So yeah, hit me up if you feel like you might want to do that at some point. And whilst the tours that we've done so far in Egypt, we've tended to try and reach at a sort of slightly lower market value than some of the other tours, because a lot of the tours are so damn expensive that they're just not available to everyday folks. Because, it's like, if a tour's
Yeah.
like 6 or 7 grand or something, like most people, that's like half their year's salary or something. They just can't justify it. So we've tried to sort of reach an audience by providing more affordable tours where possible. But we do have all the connections to do more like upmarket tours with private accesses for like renting the Great Pyramid or the Assyrian, places like that, or camping trips to the oasis in the desert. We've got all the connections to do stuff like that, but we just haven't really delved that much into those areas as yet. I mean, we've rented the pyramid privately before on an occasion, but we can do a lot more of that for the right audience. So we have all the connections to
Hmm.
make any kind of tour with all of the locations, and for any of the viewers or the listeners, like if you chose to come out, if you like the look of any of our tours, we can do kind of deals and discounts if you book for a number of people all in one go. So if you were to buy 4 full price tickets at once, we could perhaps give you like 50% off the 5th ticket, or even better than that, depending on the specific tour. This is like a general approach to some of the tours, like we can offer discounts and deals for people that are bringing a number of people with them, because obviously it's good for us and it's then good for the customer as well. And also for
Hmm.
bespoke tours, if someone contacts us and says, like, we'd like to bring this many people at this time of year to see A, B, and C sites, we can make it happen. We've got all of the connections and the infrastructure in place for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome. Sounds like there's some good good connections and flexibility there. So yeah, we'll definitely keep that in mind.
Yeah, and affordability is a big
Right.
factor for I think a lot of people. I know I looked up doing a tour in Egypt with Graham Hancock when he was actually allowed back in Egypt, and I remember telling you like I looked up the prices and I was like, nope, not for us. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like such, like any travel can become expensive, but it's kind of good that they've developed the infrastructure a lot for tourism in Egypt, because, like Egypt's tourism is booming thanks to people such as Graham Hancock that end up getting banned from the country, even though he's encouraged loads of people to go there.
Uh-huh.
But it's sort of like a double-edged sword, where the accessibility and the availability to see stuff is a lot more than it used to be now for everyday tourists, where it used to be more like people in the know would be able to see a lot of the off limits places and stuff. So it's more accessible now, but inevitably, the more popular it becomes, the more kind of westernized the prices become. So now, like in the 13 and a bit years I've been going to Egypt, the cost of things as a tourist have like rocketed up, and the cost of living for the locals have also rocketed up as well. But like if I was to rent a very cheap budget hotel in Cairo a number of years ago, for example, I could get it so cheap as a tourist, and it'd be rough and ready, but it'd be very cheap, like peanuts compared to what I pay for something in Europe, for example. But over more recent years, as the tourism's boomed, now to get a really rough, kind of not very clean Airbnb or room in a kind of rundown hotel, which would have been like really cheap for a backpacker not that many years ago, even those places now have pushed their prices up to close to like a European hotel, but the quality's not gone up with it. But there are lots of nice places, of course,
Uh-huh.
you can get the good stuff, but it's just at the lower end of quality, the prices have crept up, even though the quality hasn't. So for really cheap budget travel, it's become a lot more difficult over there now than it used to be. But, like still with the right connections and the right mindset, you can still navigate round for a lot less than a sort of less well-traveled tourist, for example, because if they know that you're a less well-traveled tourist, you're more likely to get hustled and fleeced. So, it's the prices have gone up, but also there's a bit of like how you interact with the country plays a significant part in that.
Hmm. Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about the sites in Turkey that you visited. It's just so interesting. And I think Jared mentioned this earlier, one of the places that, we don't personally know a whole lot of people who have been there. So very cool to chat with you about your experience there. Thanks for coming on.
Great. Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Yeah, I thank you guys both again for having me on again for a second show. This was a real pleasant surprise. And yeah, I hope you guys are having a great time. You're getting on well, and yeah, I look forward to speaking to you both soon.
Yeah, same here. All right, everybody, that is it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. I know it was a little bit longer of an episode, but lots of conversation to be had. Let us know if you enjoyed this episode, if you have any questions for us or our guest. I know we covered a lot today. You can find us on social media, Instagram at Temporary Locals Podcast. We're also available on all the podcasting platforms, video on Spotify, video on YouTube if you're interested in that. Jared is on Instagram and YouTube at Rover Stover. And I am on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook at Mega Goes Global if you're interested in checking out any of the other content that we post there. And with that,
I'm Jared.
And I'm Megan. Thanks for exploring with us.
And remember to be a local anywhere you go.
Bye.
Bye.